Welcome to another episode of Chax Chat. Join Chad Chelius and me, Dax Castro, where each week we wax poetic about document accessibility topics, tips, and the struggle of remediation and compliance. So sit back, grab your favorite mug of whatever, and let's get started.
Welcome, everybody. Today's podcast is sponsored by AbleDocs, makers of Access PDF for Word, Access PDF Quick Fix, as well as document remediation services. So we thank them for being our sponsor for today's podcast. My name is Chad Chelius. I'm a trainer, author, consultant, and PDF remediator, among many other things.
All right, Chad. Well, welcome to episode 3. This has been great. Really awesome. The feedback on the episodes has been great. And I think, we both bring a different flavor to our podcast that really makes it a good fit. I mean, don't you agree? What are your thoughts?
No, I totally agree. I mean, although both of us have very similar, foundational elements and backgrounds, and we also agree on different approaches, we come from a little bit of a different angle, and that's really what kind of caused us to want to create this podcast, right? Because, you and I would get together on the phone and start talking, and we would just kind of go back and forth, on different angles and different approaches. And we would be on the phone and we're like, there is so much information here that we are talking about that we really want to make it available to everybody. So,
well, and it's funny.
I agree.
We were talking on the phone today and like literally 3 different things we were mentioning. I'm like, we got to save that for a podcast. We got to save that for a podcast, right? Because it just comes out, right? So, one of the topics I wanted to talk about this week, Chad, is something that somebody reached out to me on LinkedIn, and they mentioned in something that they were looking at. And they said, well, a document can only have one H1 tag, and this document has a bunch of H1 tags. And I just kind of snickered, right? They can't see you, but you're smiling, right? Because we get this at almost every conference we go to. Someone raises their hand and says, excuse me, you can only have one H1. And I, bless their heart, I appreciate that web accessibility is what the most people who are in the accessibility world start out with. But document accessibility actually allows for more than one H1, as long as it's done appropriately, right? I was remediating this PowerPoint literally just yesterday. And in between their slides, I started remediating it, and page 1 had a title. Of course, that's the H1. And then of course the next slide had a title and content, and it went down through the thing, and I started tagging things. Now I'm tagging the title as an H1 and then the slide title as an H1 as well, as I'm going through the document, because it just makes sense, right? It's okay to have the one H1 as the title and the one H1 for each of the slides. But what they didn't realize was once I got halfway through the document that they had these next level title pages, like to separate the different sections. And I'm like, oh crap, because that is an appropriate use of it heading level 1. So I had to go back and retag all my headings so that the title was an H1, all the slide titles were H2s. And then when you got to that section break, that comes back to your H1 again, right? That's a good example of where H1s matter, right? Where how you use it matters.
Well, and not only that, I mean, you may not run into this as much with, say, a PowerPoint presentation, but when you get into larger documents, remember, we only have 6 heading levels.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so like when you get into documents that have like let's just start like a chapter title, right? Well, H1. And then you've got subheads and subheads, and a lot of times they'll go pretty deep into the hierarchy of headings. And if I chew up a heading level by saying only the title of the document can be an H1, now I only have 5 heading levels to work with.
Exactly. And that's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I've always, and going back to what you said about the web, I used multiple H1s on the web. And now I don't do HTML as much as I used to, but HTML5, one of the reasons that they created these structural elements, like an aside, a header and a footer, is because you could have an H1 in an aside within the overall context of a web page. Now, we may have web designers out there who are going to crucify me for saying that.
They will.
But fundamentally, you can do it. But from document accessibility, absolutely, I mean, What you don't want to do, never use that H tag. I wish Acrobat would get rid of that, and InDesign too. But yeah, I do use multiple H1s, for like the title, chapter titles, so on and so forth.
Well, I will tell you what's interesting is you and I have a different opinion about that. So I have poured through. So there's a document, which is the ISO 14289-1, which is the best practices for syntax for PDF UA. Right. And I think I mentioned in a previous podcast, you really do need to go download that document. It costs like $80 or something, but it's great for syntax. And one of the things that it mentions in there is the use of the H tag and what it really is for. So the H tag is a generic, it's kind of an ambiguous heading that PDF UA realizes that sometimes there are heading structures within a document that don't fall into H1, H2, H3, that in one certain section, there's a heading below, let's say your H3, that is visually a heading, but it's really not an H4 because H4 is a certain other heading in other sections. Like there's an anomaly, right? There's sometimes where you have a heading structure in a certain section where it doesn't necessarily follow the same style. There's an extra heading. Right. And so the H tag is designed to be that ambiguous, I'm not going to give you a number heading. The problem is no screen reader will recognize that it exists and it just reads it as a paragraph.
Interesting. Dax, I just learned something. I had no idea. So like maybe a good example would be like a lot of times in a designed document, you have a sidebar. Right. And in that sidebar, there's kind of like a heading for the sidebar and then content. So you're saying that instead of picking a heading level that is logical to the page, you can assign the H tag to that heading as an ambiguous heading to be used for that purpose only. The only downside is a screen reader is not going to identify it as a heading.
Right. And I'll give you a really good example. I do a lot of technical documents. The section is 1.2.5.4, and then there's paragraph text, right? So 1.2.5.4 is 4 levels deep, right? So we are H4 already. And underneath that section, they may have it broken out into 3 different subparagraphs. But those topics are, maybe it's water, wastewater, land use, and energy, right? And they've got headings inside those that H4, right? So what do you do with that? Does it become an H5? Well, really the document dictates that 1.2.3.4.5 would be your H5. So you would mess up your tag structure. You would create a weird experience if you were to tag these 3 different sections as a H5. So this is a prime example where an H tag would be super useful because it doesn't screw up my normal numbered order, my numbered heading lists, because it's just a heading. It's just bold text that happens to be a little bigger inside this section, but it's not part of my navigable numbered structure for my headings. And that's the purpose for the H tag. The problem again is that it was implemented by PDF UA, but none of the screen reading companies, JAWS or NVDA, have adopted it. The other thing is that you can go beyond H6. With PDF UA, if you have the PDF UA identifier, the goal is that identifier triggers the ability to go past H6 and go on at infinitum. If you wanted to have an H12, you could have an H12. Again, the problem is no screen reader out there will understand or look for that to recognize that, hey, this is a PDF UA document, and therefore I can go past that. So if you tag them, if you add the marker and tag it as a H11, you're just going to get a paragraph, right? So again, it's very frustrating, right? And I talked to Duff Johnson about this because he said, look, we write the code. We write the rules. If the screen reader programs out there aren't willing to follow the rules, we're not going to bend those rules to meet them. They need to come up to us.
Absolutely. And I had that same conversation with Duff because, and I think that's important for all of us to understand. And when we talk about standards, it applies to web standards. It applies to, PDF, document accessibility. And that is that PDF UA is creating the standard, but then it's up to everybody to follow that standard.
Well, and
right.
Go ahead.
I mean, if we go back to the browser wars,
right?
You know, you and I are old enough to remember,
Yep.
you know, in the 90s, right, where people would write code that would work in one browser but wouldn't work in another.
Well, remember,
you know?
it used to be you'd go to a website and it'd say best experienced using
yes,
Netscape Navigator.
Navigator, yeah. But yeah, and that's the challenge that we all face as PDF document specialists is, you know, we could follow the standard to the T, but if the assistive technology is not following that same standard, the experience may not be what we intended.
Right.
And that's the harsh reality.
See, and I have a very firm stance on this. And there are a lot of people who do not agree with my stance. And my stance is user experience first. If I have to bend the rules to make something have a good user experience, and I can validate, I've tested it with JAWS, tested it with NVDA. It's not just DAX's idea for accessibility. It is a valid, testable way to say, look, doing it this way, option B is a better user experience than option A. But option A is more code compliant. I'm going to go with option B every time, because in the end, and I say this all the time, you're not going to get sued because you didn't follow 7.2.14 of PDF UA. You're going to get sued because they tried to read your table in a screen reader and they didn't get the information they were expecting, right? And so for me, my user experience always trumps the rule, except for when it's an inconsistent user experience. So I will say my caveat is if JAWS reads it one way, NVDA reads it another way, and they're very, very different, I'm not going to just say, well, I want everybody to use JAWS, or it's going to work for JAWS, but not for NVDA. I'm going to, at that point, I might punt and say, I'm going to follow the standard and it will work mostly for both of them.
It's a bit of a sticky wicket, though, right? Because you're kind of that coder in 1993 who was writing it to work with one browser,
right?
And maybe not on the other. So so this is where you know this podcast is great, because my approach is a bit different.
Okay,
my approach is to remediate to the standard, and how it's read is out of my control. You know,
right?
So now I completely agree with what you're doing, though, because at the end of the day, you want the user experience to be great. I guess I'm taking more of the approach where I'm trying to help the standard. I'm trying to kind of force JAWS and force NVDA and force all the assistive technology to abide by the standard so that we all have a consistent experience.
Well, and I will take this
big ask, I know.
Yeah, and I will take this opportunity to say, if anybody from JAWS is listening to us right now, please contact me. I have a list of like 8 different things that you guys could literally, right now, there's a thing. NVDA is slowly creeping up to overtake the amount of JAWS users, right? And I will tell you, there are things in NVDA that don't work right, just like there are things in JAWS that don't work right. And if you want to be better than the competition, I can tell you all those things that need to be fixed. Table summaries is one of the first ones that comes to mind. But anyway, I love going to CSUN every year because I get to go talk with the people at the different booths and literally sit down with the people at JAWS. Now, it doesn't always mean that they're going to go take notes, write it, go home and fix it, but at least there's a touch point. And then do the same thing with Adobe Max. Being able to go in and talk to those teams has been great. And I'm looking forward to it. Speaking of talking to teams, so Nolan Hames, who is, if people listening to this podcast don't know who Nolan is, Nolan runs, teaches teaches PowerPoint, how to create PowerPoints, right? He is a great instructor. And I was with him at, I watched one of his sessions at, I want to say it was AxCon or CSUN, I can't remember which, but learned a ton of great ways to create PowerPoints in different ways. He's a master of being able to change charts and graphs in a way that gives you something different visually. And it's great. But he reached out to me and said, hey, Dax, I'm meeting with the Microsoft team for some, Q&A. And can you tell me what the top 3 things are about that are barriers in PowerPoint? And I said, wow, me and Chad were just talking about this in our episode, our podcast, right? And I said, the artifact tag is not really a tag. They've decided to call it a tag and assign it, right? And so I walked through that whole thing. He actually presented that to the Microsoft team. So I don't know if anything will happen from it, but at least they're hearing. At least they've got that information. So I felt a little heard, a little bit more represented.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, awesome. So next month is Global Accessibility Awareness Day, right? I don't know if you knew that or not. But it is on May 16th. It is January, February, March, April, May. Yeah, that is next month. I always have to count on my fingers. I don't know why. Since I was little, I've never been able to transcribe the numbers to the months. It's a thing. I don't know if there's other people out there listening. I always have to count on my fingers, right? So it's May 16th, Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Sorry. It is a great opportunity if you are in the accessibility space to tell people what it is you do. Not the same people that you always talk to all the time, but maybe you post on your own private Facebook. Hey, accessibility is a thing. And this is, I accidentally posted on my Facebook, and I don't have very many Facebook followers on my personal Facebook. I think I've got 200 or 300 friends. I don't have a lot. And I accidentally posted a video presentation of one of my accessibility sessions that I meant to post in the PDF accessibility Facebook group. And I just didn't change the profile, and it posted on my private channel. 3 of my friends were like, dude, I didn't know this was a thing. This is great. Give me more information. So reach out to those people that you may not think care about accessibility, because you'll never know what comes out from it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, awesome. It's time for our Who's on Twitter, right? So we do this thing every week. And, so last week, I don't know if you heard, if you didn't listen to last week's podcast, it was our very first podcast, was our accessibility rhyming guy on Twitter. So go back. I can't think of what his Twitter handle is right now, but go back and listen to that. But today's Who's on Twitter is actually not Twitter. So she has a Medium page, right? So this is Medium is articles. People who write articles use medium.com. So her name is Sherry Byrne Haber, and she is CPAC certified, which is the International Association of Accessibility Professionals certification. And it is the Certified Professional in Accessibility Core Competencies, which is a long way to say she has a really good understanding of accessibility overall. And she's got this. I'll link to her Medium page in the transcript for this, but it's sherryburnhaber.medium.com. And she's always got these great articles. Her profile says she's a blogger, disability advocate, and nerd, bringing the fire on ableism. She is an architect at VMware, wheelchair user, and a deaf daughter with a deaf daughter. And she specializes in law and has a business background. So I want to have her, Chad. We should have her on as a guest. What do you think?
I think that'd be fantastic. I think she could bring a really interesting insight that could help us all with what we do.
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe she could talk on how to create an accessibility program within your organization, right? How do you start that, right? And that's such a big topic, right? I know I presented at AXCON on this topic, and there were a lot of good feedback, but it's really hard, right? Because you've got a couple of different ways to approach it. Most of us, it's bottom up, right? Someone says, hey, stuff about website, stuff about, Word docs, learn how to make this accessible. It's got to be a thing.
Yeah, no, you're right. And, we actually went through some of that when we were writing questions for the IAAP exam, where
that was the hardest section.
Where, we basically, part of the certification is helping to implement an accessibility process in your organization.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. A lot of times it starts at the bottom and goes up. Like, you've got to convince, your managers, your superiors, that this is a thing, that this is important, and
it's pushing mud up. It's like pushing mud uphill.
It is.
Well, I will say that she's got some great perspectives on this, and I'd love to have her on. So we'll see if we can schedule her as a future guest.
That'd be awesome.
Awesome. Now, Chad, when you're remediating, how much of a deep dive do you look at for things like color blindness in your infographics and things when you're trying to validate for compliance? Are your clients concerned about that, or do you use it as part of your accessibility checklist? Or tell me more about that.
Yeah. So I mean, I definitely do, but as somebody who remediates PDFs, I don't work for an organization where I have a lot of control over the process.
Right.
So often a client will come to me and say, make this document accessible. One of the things that I know we both preach, Dax, is that you've got to think about accessibility at the beginning and not the end.
Right.
And if a client gives me a PDF file and says, make this accessible, there's not a lot I can do about the color contrast at that point.
Right.
Because, you're fighting, me personally, I'm fighting an uphill battle to try to get that addressed, which goes even beyond PDF remediation at all.
Right.
Now, if I have the source documents, it's a little bit easier, right? I do a lot of InDesign work. And so I do check for color contrast. I also check for colorblind, accessibility. And I will make recommendations to the client, right? I will say, hey, listen, this does not have sufficient contrast. Can we make a change here?
You know what's interesting is that Illustrator has a colorblind mode. I don't know if you knew that, but you can go into the view proof setup, and then you can set deuteranopia or protanopia. And the deuteranopia is the most common. It's that red-green color blindness. And then you just do proof color, you check the box for proof preview, right? But what's interesting is InDesign doesn't have one, right?
No.
And I wish, again, Adobe folks, if you're listening, we just add that to InDesign? I'd love to be able to just turn it on and have all my things valid, show me colorblind mode, because it just makes it so much easier. Now, I do use Microsoft Simulations, which is a really good colorblind checker. And the nice thing is it floats over any program I have on my computer. And then on my phone, I actually have Sim Daltonism. It's actually for Mac or PC. And Sim Daltonism is nice when you're in a room with people, right? And they bring you a printed document and you're like, oh, that's a colorblind barrier. And they say, what? Let me show you. And I swipe open the app and I hold it over the document. And they're like, whoa. And so so it's really, really great. But you're right. I mean, we a lot of times there's kind of two flavors of accessibility, right? It's here's the document. It's already done. The cake is baked. Now make it accessible. Then there's the other ones where here's our source. We're in the modification process. Can you, make it accessible, do what we need to do? The problem is that sometimes even when you have the source, the graphics inside it have already been approved by like 3 or 4 different layers of approval.
Yeah.
And you can't always go back to them and say, hey, agency ABC, this is a colorblind barrier for the 30 maps you have going on. Right now, we're working on environmental impact report for a large client. The document is 6,000 pages, Chad.
Wow.
6,000.
Wow.
There are 50 or 60 maps in the document. And the nice thing has been is that for the past 6 months, I've been meeting with their graphic design team, or the GIS team, talking about how to create the colorblind awareness, using a palette that's colorblind friendly. Of course, the use of color only, the WCAG rule, 1.4.1 says, you cannot use color alone as the only means of communicating information. So teaching them that principle allows them to just take it and run with it and then make a set of maps for me to review, rather than them trying, failing, me to reviewing it, telling them they're wrong, them going back and trying something else, which just eats up time like nobody's business. So,
it does. And going back to your point about within an organization, sometimes, I'll get a PDF from my client where somebody gave them the PDF, right? And I don't know how else to put this, but like it all rolled downhill. And by the time it gets to me, I'm like 4 steps removed from whoever created the document. A lot of times my client doesn't know who created the document.
Sure. So
it's really a challenging thing. But another thing I wanted to bring up, Dax, we're talking about the color blindness. Adobe recently implemented a feature on their Adobe Color website.
Right, exactly.
That allows you to see colorblind safe color themes.
Right.
And if you guys are not familiar with Adobe Color, go to color.adobe.com. And basically Adobe Color is a tool that is designed to help you pick colors for your project. You could choose different color harmonies. It'll pick colors that go well with other colors. But if you look at the top of the page, there is an accessibility tools category now.
Yep.
And one of the intents you can choose is colorblind safe.
Right.
And when you pick a theme, it'll tell you like if 2 colors are in conflict and allow you to make some adjustments to try to get them out of conflict.
Well, what I really love the ability to drag those little circles around. I mean, this works really well when you have the flexibility of just color trial and error, when you're just trying to come up with a color scheme that works. And, basically what it does is as you drag these little circles around, it tells you instantly, it says, I'm looking at one right now, it says C and D are in conflict. Move the swatches on the color wheel to make colors distinct and colorblind safe. So it gives you some ideas. You can plug in the hex values, or you can change the color mode to RGB or CMYK or whatever color space you're using. What was interesting is there is at AxCon, there was a presentation by someone on color for the web. Now, what was awesome is, and I caught the last half of his session, that they use a color model that uses these numbers that aren't hex or aren't RGB or any of that. And he can say, look, use this any color in the 600 series or any color in the 500 series with a color from the 200 series. Like he gives you these, because of the way the color system is arranged, it gives you the ability to give general color ranges that work well together. And, I'll have to reach out. Maybe in a future podcast, I'll figure out what that was and give some more specific information. But I thought, wow, it'd be great if we could implement that at a document level. But we're so married to RGB, CMYK, that, even hex color.
Lab.
Yeah, lab. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But color.adobe.com is a great tool. And they are, the nice thing is that it links to your CC library too. So,
once you find a theme, like I said, whether it's colorblind safe or not, you can save that theme to a Creative Cloud library, which then in turn becomes accessible to all of your Creative Cloud applications. And you can even access it on your phone if you want to, which is kind of neat.
Which is awesome. Yeah. In a team environment, I think it's probably one of the most underutilized features of all the Adobe programs is the CC libraries, because it's not just color. You can drag in styles, objects, swatches, symbols, right? The ability to have consistent symbols across multiple editors is super key, because everybody wants to nudge something this way or that way and, change it slightly. It's like, look, use the symbol the way it is. And that's, and anybody can walk into the document and know exactly what they're supposed to use. So,
yeah. And so if any of you are curious about that or want to know more about, the Creative Cloud libraries, in the show notes, I'll put a link to my LinkedIn Learning course on the Adobe Creative Cloud that covers the libraries and Creative Cloud documents and stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, I didn't even know that you had a LinkedIn course on Creative Cloud. That's cool. I'll definitely refer you there. All right, Chad. Well, that's another episode, man. We did it again. I literally could sit here and talk all for hours with you about all this stuff.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, once we get going, we try to stay focused, but the subject matter, PDF accessibility, just causes us to go off on these tangents, like one thing just leads to another, and there's so much content to cover. So thanks everybody for joining us this week. Just as a reminder, Dax and I are speaking at the Creative Pro Conference this year, which is on May 17th to 21st. Due to COVID, it is an online only event, but Dax and I have done multiple of these now. And believe it or not, the online events have gotten really great feedback. So don't let the fact that you're not in person with anybody deter you. There's lots of great content to be covered, and we hope to see you there.
One of the great features about those conferences is that even though the material, the sessions themselves, for the most part, because there are live sessions, a lot of them are recorded. But the nice thing is that we're sitting in the chat. And when people are asking questions, it's really great to be able to answer those questions right there, because, how many times are you on stage? Can you just stop and be like, hey, I'm going to answer your question, right? Right. So it's a great feature of, some people say, oh, well, it's just a bunch of recordings. No, not really. There's a lot of really good interaction that's going on inside the chats. And then we do have live panels and live Q&A and all of that after the session, where you can go into the chat rooms and video chat with us and talk about the different questions you have. It was really a great experience. I really like that aspect of the virtual event. Well, all right, guys, thank you so much for joining us again for another week of Chax Chat with Chad Chelius and me, Dax Castro, where we take you down the road of remediation and unravel accessibility for you. Join us next week, where we're going to have some guest speakers and some more great topics for you to enjoy.
See you later, guys.